Welcome. I'm Zachary Schaefer, CEO of United for Infrastructure, and thanks to all of you for joining us to kick off this series on infrastructure, resilience, and recovery in a post-COVID world. United for Infrastructure is a nonpartisan, nonprofit infrastructure education and advocacy organization that convenes leaders from business, labor, and the public sector. Our mission is to elevate the policies, people, and projects needed to ensure that our nation's infrastructure serves the lives and livelihoods of all Americans. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Hannon Armstrong, and a special thanks to the Milken Institute and to Dan Carroll, who you'll hear from a few minutes later, and who directs the Resilient Infrastructure Financing Initiative at Milken's Center for Financial Markets. And I'd like to thank our COO and co-founder, Patrick Sable, and the great team at UFI who have made this series come to life. Resilience is not a new term for us in the infrastructure community, but it has taken on an expanded meaning during this crisis. As we're sadly seeing today in Michigan, families and communities are struggling with flooding, burst dams, and impassable roads, the resilience challenge we've been discussing for many years. And managing things like emergency response, evacuations, and shelters while in the middle of a pandemic, the resilience challenge that's entered our lexicon, at least in the infrastructure community in recent months, is a whole new dimension to this problem. We in the Milken Institute wanted to open a conversation with policymakers, business leaders, and experts in the community on how we can build long-term resilience into pre-COVID and post-COVID infrastructure needs and begin to frame what the impacts of this crisis will mean for how we deliver, fund, and finance, and build those projects. We invite you to join us every Wednesday at noon for the next 6 weeks as we explore these issues. Our first 3 sessions, beginning today, are focused on the policy and the economy of infrastructure and on what resilient infrastructure means today. The last 3 sessions will get into the weeds a bit more on the practice of implementing and financing resilience at the project level. Stay tuned for our speakers and program for later dates in this series. Now it's my honor to welcome 2 distinguished leaders for a virtual fireside chat to kick off this series. John Bel Edwards, Governor of Louisiana, is joining us from the state's Emergency Operations Command Center. The governor and his state have been on the vanguard of building resilient infrastructure solutions to a range of threats over the last several decades, and we're so grateful he's able to share his experience and insights with us today. He'll be interviewed by Suzanne Clark, who serves as president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We are honored to continue to work with her and the Chamber on this issue. The Chamber, along with the AFL-CIO, Business Roundtable, American Society of Civil Engineers, Brookings, and several other groups, are founders of our organization, and we are so grateful for their support and partnership. With that, Suzanne, I'll turn the screen over to you.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. I'd just like to say that I love the phrase Emergency Command Center, and that's now what I'm going to start calling my dining room, which is where I've been working. It is now my Emergency Command Center. I just want to say quickly that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is delighted to participate today. Infrastructure has long been a key priority for our members. We're proud to be a founding member of United for Infrastructure. And today's session about infrastructure resilience after COVID-19 and a new normal couldn't be more timely, and we couldn't have a better person to talk to. Governor Edwards sure knows a thing or two about resilience, coming from the great state of Louisiana, and also about how important infrastructure is to economic growth. In fact, our current chairman of the board, Donahue, runs a construction business in Louisiana and was just this morning complimenting Governor, your great leadership through COVID-19. So thank you so much for joining this panel this morning. And let me just start, before we get to infrastructure, by saying, how's it going in the state? How are you feeling on the ground there? And how are you feeling about reopening?
Well, Suzanne, thank you very much for the opportunity for the question. And I am so delighted to be joining you all today, the folks from the Milken Institute and Zach and everybody else, and to see such a broad array of stakeholders coming together to support one common cause, which is resilient infrastructure. The state of Louisiana is doing so much better. Look, 2 months ago, we had the highest growth rate of COVID-19 cases anywhere in the world, according to the data coming out of Johns Hopkins. And to be here 2 months later with reduced case count, reduced hospitalizations, the lowest number of deaths each of the last 3 days that we've had in 2 months, we're doing so much better. We've got a long way to go. There's still a lot of COVID-19 out there, but the people of Louisiana have been really good about taking this seriously, doing their part to slow the spread through social distancing, good hygiene, making sure they were staying at home, and now wearing a mask. On Friday of last week, we went to phase 1 of our reopening. And I say reopening, I don't like that word because unlike some states, I suspect, we never closed manufacturing. We never closed construction, which allowed all of our current infrastructure work to continue. We fully embraced all the CISA guidance on essential infrastructure, left that open without any restrictions whatsoever, never closed non-essential retail. We just put some limitations on the number of people that could be in a store. But last Friday, we did go into phase 1. My fingers are crossed. I'm hopeful that we're not going to see a spike in cases, but we will be able to monitor much more closely because we will do 200,000 tests this month alone, in the month of May, a lot of that in our congregate settings. And so bottom line is we're doing a lot better. And as you know, the federal government has poured trillions of dollars into this effort, all really, really helpful. I just wonder if a couple of years from now, we're not all going to wish that we had spent $1 trillion of that on infrastructure so that we would have something permanent to show for that effort and still get the temporary benefit out of it with the economic stimulus it would provide, all of the companies that would be working and all of the downstream suppliers of materials and all that sort of stuff. But in any event, we're doing much better here in Louisiana. Suzanne, I appreciate the question. And we welcome any assistance you all can give us and certainly your prayers for the people here in Louisiana.
Well, thank you for that, Governor. And you know, you mentioned infrastructure as a long-term priority, and I know you're balancing both short-term and long-term needs as you think about infrastructure development. So talk a little bit about those priorities and whether the pandemic has shifted some of the emphasis in your mind.
Well, it really hasn't shifted the emphasis in my mind, but I can tell you this is not universal. There are some people in the legislature who are really pushing for us not to engage in the full array of infrastructure investment that we had planned, not just with respect to money that we would bond out, but last year our economy was the 4th fastest growing in the country when this pandemic hit. We had run over $500 million in surplus last year. And we were pulling out $325 million of that for infrastructure. And we've got some members in the legislature who now want to hold on to that cash and not do the investment. I think that's a mistake because, as you know, states, we have to run balanced budgets. We can't do stimulus work on the budgeting side with respect to deficit spending. So I think we need to do what we can to support the economy through infrastructure investments, which keeps more people at work, which employs a lot of folks downstream to provide the material, whether it's asphalt or concrete or you name it, and also the engineers and others that are involved. So we're working through that now. I am trying to get the legislature that happens to be in session to allow this infrastructure investments to go forward. So these are investments on top of what would be in the ordinary program. More than $115 million for roads and bridges, more than $115 million for coastal restoration work, which is a particular challenge here in Louisiana. And then we have other infrastructure on college campuses and state buildings and that sort of thing that we want to take care of as well. So we're having some basic philosophical discussions right now about what is the right approach during this pandemic. We know that the revenue is down right now, and so do you hoard the cash or do you go forward with the investments? I want to go forward with the investments because I think it stimulates the economy, but also you then have a better infrastructure in the state to foster continued economic growth thereafter. And so that's what I'm looking to do. We're working with legislative leadership. I believe at the end of the day we're going to be successful on that. But you know, when I became governor, we had a $2 billion state general fund deficit in the state of Louisiana. It made it very, very difficult. But we have been very creative in Louisiana, And we've embraced new approaches, whether it's the use of Garvey bonds for the first time in our state's history, innovative procurement such as design and build. We actually have the very first ever public-private partnership for infrastructure in the state of Louisiana underway right now. I've hired a resilience officer to integrate best practices concerning resilience across all of our government institutions. And we are making more investments in the coast than ever before. And something I said at my inauguration, I want to share with you, Suzanne, and everybody else. With the projects that we will commence during my second term, when those projects are completed, we will be building more land in Louisiana than we are losing for the first time in several generations. And that is really exciting, but we can't get there if we don't make the investments. And so that's the focus that we have right now, especially with the with the legislature here in Louisiana.
Governor, you made so many important points there. I wish I had time to pick up on all of them. I think the coastal resilience is really interesting. Of course, funding is always the big issue when you get to infrastructure. But let me ask you to expand a little bit into another piece of infrastructure. A lot of us think of asphalts and roads and bridges, et cetera. But what we're also seeing in this time is the importance of internet access, given the move to remote work and remote learning and telemedicine. And so the broadband challenges, particularly in a state as diverse as yours, also seem complex at this time. And so what do you think about the public-private partnership opportunities there?
Well, we had identified this as something we really wanted to focus on in the second term. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. Before the pandemic hit, we established a Broadband for Everyone in Louisiana commission in order to study the footprint of our state, where we have adequate broadband, where we do not. It's no surprise that in our rural areas, we do not. That impacts the ability of our children to learn. Our small businesses aren't as competitive as they could be. Telehealth suffers. And so this pandemic has really made what we already knew to be a priority. It just made it much more urgent. And then on top of that, we also had a commission that was out there to revitalize rural Louisiana. And it's looking at traditional infrastructure, as you just mentioned, but also broadband. And so now, for example, I just found out that my discretionary funding of a little more than $50 million that the CARES Act is providing to me for education. And I'm going to spend the vast majority of that to facilitate distance learning, particularly in our rural districts where we're so challenged. And of course, I have to spend it on devices, but I also have to spend it on connectivity. But most of that's going to be done on MiFis so that we can take advantage of the cellular infrastructure in the state of Louisiana. But we are going to have to work with Cox, with AT&T, with CenturyLink, because we have to create permanent infrastructure. We have to do that through investments. And it is going to have to be a partnership, because my personal belief is if the market was going to take care of this, it would have happened a long time ago. So we're going to have to partner with those providers and others in order to make this where the business model works, that they can go to places like Lake Providence, Louisiana, and East Carroll, which for generations has been one of the poorest places in the country, and deliver this high-speed internet access. Critically important. We're working with them right now to figure out how we do that, and we want to take some of the federal funding that we're getting and make sure that we invest in the permanent broadband access infrastructure, as well as what we have to do short-term, because I've got students who need to be learning right now, and they're particularly challenged because they can't participate in distance learning. And we don't know what the future looks like. We don't know if in August our schools are going to, we think they will be, but if we have another flare-up of this virus, we don't know if our community colleges and technical colleges are going to be able to operate on campus, and our universities and our K through 12 schools. So this permanent infrastructure is critically important, and we're talking to all of these private providers every single day to move this forward. Deloitte is working with us here in Louisiana to inventory where we have and don't have adequate access, and coming up with different strategies and funding sources to work with all these providers in order to expand that.
You know, I got distracted for a minute. If you notice a little tear in my eye, it's just because I have a 14-year-old. And anytime anybody brings up the potential of not having school in the fall, I get a little bit verklempt.
Well, we think we will. We're working towards it, but just in case, we have to be ready.
I know. You know, when we think about infrastructure, we do talk about public-private partnerships as solutions. We talk about the funding mechanisms, but we also think about some of the regulatory roadblocks, because as we know, regulations aren't agile. And so at a time when we are really trying to be nimble and flexible and in one way take advantage of this horrible crisis, right, but use it to propel infrastructure priorities that we've long held, are there regulatory impediments you think we need to be addressing?
Well, there are, but quite honestly, we've been talking about these for a long time and working with the Trump administration, and they have actually been able to process our permit applications much faster through an approach where, rather than having all these different federal entities look at them in sequence, they're looking at them simultaneously. And for example, we have really big sediment diversion projects on the Mississippi River, because one of the reasons we're losing so much coast in Louisiana is we have disconnected the river from the coast. And in 1927, when we started putting the levees up, we're no longer allowing the river to flood and put sediment where it would naturally happen. So through some strategic diversions, both on the east bank and the west bank of the river, we're trying to reconnect the coast to sediment. Well, these are really, really big projects that each over $1 billion. And the federal government, because of the Trump administration, has really accelerated the permitting on that, which is extremely helpful. Now we haven't gotten all the way through the process, and there's a chance we're going to hit a snag, and there's a chance that litigation will be filed by some environmental groups and things like that we still have to overcome. But we are working really hard to do what we can to get the permitting, all of these regulatory things in order. And look, there's a role for that, as we all know. We don't want to inadvertently do more damage to the environment than is necessary, and so forth. But for example, Suzanne, we're trying to rebuild the coast where we now have open water. Well, it stands to reason that when we do that, marine mammals are no longer going to be able to swim where we're rebuilding coast. But the Marine Mammal Protection Act would prevent us from rebuilding our coast if we don't get waivers from it. We were actually able to do that with Congress for these diversions, but it was much harder, took much longer than you might think, because the very purpose of these projects, and environmentalists embrace them, is to rebuild coastal Louisiana. But we had environmentalists and certain laws that were really getting in the way of that. So it takes a lot of effort. The other thing is, if one of the reasons that all the emphasis goes on shovel-ready projects is because you never know if you're going to be able to get the other projects through the pipeline. But if every time you have an opportunity to accelerate projects, you're doing those that are shovel-ready, which, by the way, are important because you can bring them to bear real quickly, but you're leaving out all of your engineering and that sort of thing. But if you can work through all of these regulatory hurdles, then you can expand the types of projects that you can do and quickly bring them to fruition and spread that economic impact out across a broader sector of the economy.
You are really singing a chamber song there, which is, we all want to live where there is safe water and clean environments and all of that, but regulation isn't always the nimble and flexible partner that we need in balancing those two priorities.
Yeah,
I love that.
That's right. And I think we can all acknowledge it was all well intended, but there are adverse consequences that are unintended in many cases, and just being able to work through that, and it takes more time, more effort, more money than most people can imagine.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I know that you only have a few more minutes. I want to try to get two quick questions in. So a bit of a lightning round here. We have coming up reauthorizations for both surface transportation and the water bills by September 30th. What does it mean to you and to your great state if those lapse?
Well, we just can't allow that to happen. And I'll tell you, we're well positioned here because our entire congressional delegation is on top of this. Louisiana is uniquely positioned among all 50 states right now in the sense that our water management is so critically important to us. We have issues here that other states are going to have soon. The perfect trifecta is hitting us. So we have sea level rise, we have subsidence, and we have coastal erosion. And while the problems are more acute here than they are anywhere else in the country, these are problems that are going to visit much more of the United States in the not too distant future. But all of this is critically important. For example, we have post-Panamax vessels that can no longer get up the Mississippi River because it's not dredged deep enough. And so we've got to be able to dredge the river at least all the way to Baton Rouge in order to take advantage of those vessels. Otherwise, our ports are no longer going to be as competitive as ports elsewhere. And right now we have the largest port complex on the Mississippi River of anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Well, that's not going to be possible for us going forward if we don't get more money for dredging. And there's so many other parts of the Water Resource Development Act, the WRDA bill, that is critically important to us. But Steve Scalise, Congressman Steve Scalise, we got Garrett Graves here from Baton Rouge. We also have two senators. They're all on top of this, and I think they're going to work very hard to make sure that these bills don't sunset and that they get continued. Otherwise, it'll be a disaster for us, and not just for us, but for the rest of the country.
Well, from your lips to God's ears. Okay, we have 1 minute. So let me ask you to wrap up here with this question, which is, you said at the beginning, you kind of brought the two topics together of this horrible pandemic and infrastructure. And so let me ask you to close out by telling the audience your views on what role infrastructure investment could play in recovery from this economic crisis.
Well, I think it could be the bridge between what is by definition temporary assistance, which is incredibly important. Whether you're talking about a temporary increase in the amount of the Medicaid budget that gets paid for by the federal government, or the unemployment benefits, the pandemic benefits that will expire in July, most of that stuff is temporary. But if we would take some part of our overall effort and make it significant and devote it to infrastructure, you get the economic benefit in the short and medium term, but you also get the benefit of that infrastructure going forward, so that the economy can flourish. One of the real shortcomings we have in Louisiana, not unlike many states, is we have a road system that really needed to be expanded many years ago. We need a new Mississippi River Bridge here in Baton Rouge in the worst way. Very expensive project, but we don't have enough volume of traffic to make tolls a viable solution to pay for all of it. But if we had some infrastructure investment that could buy down the cost of the project, then the tolling component becomes viable, and we can make it happen. And so those are the sorts of things that we're looking for out of the federal government right now. It would make a tremendous difference. And it would be the one part of the response to COVID-19 that 20 years from now, you would be able to look at the ground and say, this happened in 2020 because of COVID-19. The rest of it is going to be very much gone by that point.
Governor, I thought you made a really substantive contribution to this conversation, and in a way that's really easy to access. So thank you so much for those comments. We really appreciate.
Thank you. And tell Mara I appreciate her. She and her husband, I've known them for many, many years. They're really, really good people. You couldn't be in better hands than in Mara Donahue in terms of your leadership right now.
No, sir, I think that's true. So thank you again. Pleasure to do this with you. And let me turn the program over to Dan Carroll, Director of the Milken Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Governor Edwards, for a fantastic and insightful discussion. It's my honor to be your friendly moderator for the next great panel with 4 fantastic innovators and leaders in the resilience space. First of all, quickly about our speakers. Secretary Kathleen Theoratis was named the Secretary of Environment for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 2019. But before that was the point person in state government for what many resilient infrastructure nerds like me consider to be the best state and local resilient infrastructure program out there, and we'll hear from her on that. Colin O'Mara is the president of the National Wildlife Federation, our next panelist. He led the Delaware Department of DNR as Cabinet Secretary 2009 to 2014, and as you'll hear, is a leader in making natural infrastructure a key priority for communities across the US. Melissa Roberts is the founder and ED for the American Flood Coalition, a nonpartisan group of governments, elected officials, military leaders, businesses, and civic groups that have come together to accelerate adaptation to the reality of rising seas, stronger storms, and more frequent flooding, better known as the terrible stuff that is happening right now in Michigan, to remind us that there are other challenges on top of COVID, as the governor and Suzanne were talking about. And then finally, I'm delighted to welcome Kate Gordon, who is Governor Newsom's lead climate and resilience advisor, former colleague, and probably best known for really smart work with Michael Bloomberg, Hank Paulson, and others authoring the well-regarded Risky Business Report a few years back that looked at climate and adaptation and the risks and costs to taxpayers. I can't think of a better group of leaders to frame the challenges ahead for our series, which is happening today, and as Zach pointed out, for the next 5 Wednesdays to come, so get your lunches ready. Better yet, we've got folks who aren't just theorists, but are working to advance these new partnerships and innovative models and ready to scale them up to meet this national resilience moment that Governor Bel Edwards just highlighted. So I'm going to start with Secretary Theoratis. Katie, I'm going to start with you. Governor Edwards described some of the work that Louisiana is doing on meeting their resilience challenges. You and your boss, Governor Charlie Baker, have been leaders in frontline implementation work on community resilience, specifically your groundbreaking MVP program. Please tell us what that is and what MVP stands for.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Milken Institute and the United Infrastructure for convening this panel. It's wonderful to be able to still have these opportunities for connection during what is certainly a difficult time, and so I just can't say how pleased I am. Governor Baker, I know, was supposed to join Governor Edwards actually in Louisiana for a resiliency conference this spring, and that was something that had to be taken off the agenda, but I think it was just a pleasure to hear from him this morning and how much of a priority resilient infrastructure is going forward in that state. Here in Massachusetts, we have been advancing climate resilience implementation as well as strong climate mitigation goals across the administration for the last 5 years. And it's only in many ways taken on a heightened significance during the pandemic. Over 5 years in Massachusetts, we've spent about $780 million on specific resiliency investments and are looking to get that number to $1 billion by 2020. But one of the key pieces of our sort of statewide resiliency program has been our partnership program with local communities, and that is done through our municipal vulnerability preparedness program, or our MVP program. And what this program does is it's a state and local partnership. It requires communities to go through we call it a planning light process that brings together all of the different sectors of a town or city with science and data on climate change and projections that are specific to that area of the state, and then to look through vulnerabilities, strengths within the communities, and challenges that the community faces, whether from climate or otherwise, and to come up with a list of key actions and a phasing of those actions. And then we attach that planning program to a action grant program, which provides direct funding for investments in communities. And many of these investments are in resilient infrastructure, whether it's both physical infrastructure or sometimes less physical infrastructure. And we've seen everything from significant investments in culverts and resilient coastlines, living shorelines, to programs to enable people to have better access to different services in a community. But we have a wide variety of challenges, and I think the program works because it is designed to incorporate local knowledge and feedback and buy-in into a very simple planning process and then to real dollars. And so in 3 years, we've gotten 82% of Massachusetts cities and towns enrolled in the program.
That's a great partnership. Thank you. Colin, you're next. I know you as a half full, not half empty kind of guy. You see a lot of opportunities in natural infrastructure as a way to drive both recovery and resilience. And I know you and your partners have been busy documenting NEPA Ready projects all over the country. I'd like you to share more about that approach and also fill in what NEPA means.
Sure. So one of the challenges that we've traditionally faced when we try to move massive amounts of infrastructure is that there tend to be insufficient numbers of projects that are ready to go. We saw this in 2009, where a lot of the buzz was around are projects shovel ready, and so one of the things that we've been working on is really trying to do an assessment nationwide of the number of projects that are ready to go. We've authorized all kinds of projects at the federal level. The Water Resources Development Act does this every year. There's projects that have been well done, but there's projects like that. There's projects in the transportation bill. There's projects in the clean water state revolving funds. And so there's a lot of work like that that's ready to go. The other thing the federal government's done over the last 10 years, though, is mandate a whole series of state level plans as conditions of getting funding for different things. So for example, there's a state wildlife grants program, and you've put together a 10-year state wildlife action plan that's very, very specific about what you do to recover species of greatest conservation need. There's state forest action plans. There are state comprehensive outdoor recreation plans. There are state hazard mitigation plans. There are state coastal resilience plans. There are state coastal management plans. I mean, we have all these different plans on the books that are really are as close to kind of what I call NEPA ready as possible. They've been vetted. They went through a public process. A lot of the projects have already gone through analysis. And so rather than just thinking through the lens of like kind of the federal side of the state, and look, there's a lot we can do through surface transportation and advanced transportation. There's a lot we can do through water projects and the Army Corps. Thinking about how we move money to the states and to the local governments to actually implement projects that are ready to go. They could put a lot of people to work that also don't require kind of the federal kind of pinch point or bottleneck that too often kind of holds up projects, could actually get more projects on the ground quickly and employ people. And so we see a handful of big areas that we should focus on. Look, there's a lot on recovering wildlife, and of course, I'll start there as the wildlife guy with my Ranger Rick above me. But there's a lot around ecosystem resilience and restoration. There's a lot of work on reclamation of abandoned mines, coal mines, hard rock mines, orphaned wells. There's a lot of work to be done around recreational infrastructure. There's $20 billion of backlog just in our national parks, and that's before you get to the state parks and local parks. There's a lot of work to be done in forestry, which is going to both help manage our forests, make them more resilient to these mega fires that we're seeing, particularly across the West, and have them pull more tons of carbon out of the air. There's things on private lands as well. And so there's a whole suite of these investments. And the nice thing is they're completely bipartisan. These are things that don't kind of make anybody's heads explode because it's work that has to be done. We're going to pay for it anyway. And I've been saying lately, let's rebuild a 21st century civilian conservation corps as a way to put a ton of young people to work because they're out of work more than anybody else right now. So this could be a bipartisan sweet spot. And frankly, no one's done it better than Governor Edwards and his predecessors because the Coastal Master Plan in Louisiana is one of the best in the country. I mean, it shows how to put people to work and it's ready to go. They need about $100 billion to implement it, and they're only getting a couple $1 billion a year. So that kind of stuff could move mountains very quickly.
That's great, Colin. I'm going to say you're 3/4 full. That was excellent. Melissa Roberts from the American Flood Coalition. You guys work with communities across the country, focusing on adaptation to the challenges of flooding and sea level rise. We all know that investing in pre-disaster mitigation, the kind of planning that Colin was talking about, to build back stronger, are good lines for politicians, but easier said than done. What are you seeing out there that brings you hope?
Yeah, and thanks for having me here today, and especially getting to start with some things that we're seeing out there that give us hope in these times where we're seeing a lot of, things that are more difficult. And, as you mentioned, investing before disasters strike, building back stronger, it's all easier said than done. But especially in communities that have had repeated storms, constant tidal flooding, we're really starting to see the debate shift. It's moving from if this is happening and whether it's important to really a debate of ideas and solutions to address what is happening. And we're seeing innovation, we're seeing political leaders show some real courage, and we're seeing communities rally together around an urgent imperative. And in the last few years, we've really seen highlights from places like Houston, Charleston, and Miami. So for example, in Houston, we witnessed something that I never thought we'd see happen. You know, after 3 500-year storm events in 3 years, we saw a change in the city from the 100-year flood standard to the 500-year flood standard. In Charleston, which is now seeing tidal flooding roughly once a week, we've seen really unconventional allies come together. So, you know, hospitals, businesses, civic leaders, environmental groups, along with the city, in a multi-month visioning exercise to address what's really become the top political priority in the city and to chart a path forward. And in Miami, we saw the success of the $400 million Miami Forever bond, which dedicated $192 million to address the impact of sea level rise and flooding, and was really kind of a high water mark, excuse the pun. And, you know, we were involved in the educational campaign around the bond, and 6 weeks before it was on the ballot, we were incredibly worried that it was going to fail because we were asking people to do something really hard, right? We were asking residents to tax themselves to invest in pre-disaster mitigation. And what gives me hope is in that case, what we saw was that we ended up with roughly 1 in 3 potential voters in the city actually visiting the educational site, miamiforever.org, to learn about the bond because people were really invested in the issue. And, you know, when it was on the ballot, we saw 57% of voters in favor of the bond and saw it pass, which at the time was one of the largest commitments of its kind. And since then, we've seen other ones follow in other cities. And I think another thing that's really hopeful here is we saw a virtuous cycle, right? After the bond passed, we saw Moody's specifically cite the Miami Forever bond and the proactive investment there as a factor in their decision to improve Miami's general obligation credit rating. And across the country, you know, we're seeing these sorts of examples of real on-the-ground community leadership. And I think where we need to go next is making it easier for these changes to happen before communities have to suffer, you know, multiple devastating flood events.
Thanks, Melissa. That was great. And I should say we're getting some interesting questions through the Zoom, and we'll try to weave some of those in. And I also wanted to note before asking Kate a question, the panelists have agreed to stay a couple minutes extra if we need the time. And so you can plan your Zoom schedule accordingly. So Kate, you know, even before COVID came to town, your team in the governor's office came into office dealing with a few minor issues of wildfires, creating homelessness, power outages, a big utility bankruptcy. Tell us how you've been tackling some of those resilience challenges. And remember, I'll come back at everyone in the next round in terms of post-COVID questions.
Thanks, Dan. First, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with other folks doing this work who I really admire from across the country, and particularly Governor Edwards and his team as well. I actually did it when I was at Center for American Progress, a lot of work on the Restore Act after the Deepwater Horizon spill, really looking at these issues of kind of coastal recovery as an economic stimulus. So it's kind of full circle 10 years later here. You're right, Dan. We came in, Governor Newsom started last year his first term, and the first week of his first term, PG&E, which is not only our largest utility, but the largest utility by surface area in the country, declared bankruptcy. We were coming off of some severe fires from 2018, and we spent the first 6 to 8 months just really trying to deal with that situation, come up with a set of policies with the legislature on wildfire recovery, as well as resilience, and also just critical issues like insurance and victim compensation. And then, of course, entered into another wildfire season, because that's what happens in the fall in California. We're a huge state, as everybody knows, and we are, there is no climate risk that we don't face. So we have fire, sea level rise, inland flooding, we have glacial melt, we have snowpack, and water availability issues. We, of course, have extreme heat as well. So we really are dealing with these issues constantly in every part of the year and every decision we make. And I think that's the key thing in terms of the last year and a half. Governor Newsom has been really struck by the way the financial markets have shifted in thinking about climate risk as not a environmental issue or sort of a sideline, resources issue, but really a critical, material risk, not only to our state budgets, to our population, to our communities, that needs to be part of mainstream decision making. And he signed an executive order last fall that essentially directed us agencies to incorporate climate planning, both in terms of mitigation, so lower emissions, and also in terms of risk reduction, into all of our planning. So into everywhere where the state is a major asset owner and investor. And again, really looking at what the private sector has done on this. Larry Fink from BlackRock's letter to CEOs this year highlighted the key point that climate risk is investment risk. You can't separate these things out, particularly if you're a major investor in assets, in fixed assets that are in specific places and that are subject to climate risk. So we're spending time, and since the executive order, really digging in on the places we have the most significant infrastructure investments. That's our transportation department, as it is for many people, as well as our Department of General Services. We have about 19 million square feet of state office buildings. We have about 51,000 fleet vehicles. We lease a significant amount more. So we're making decisions constantly as a state that are significant from a resilience perspective. And I think that's important, and it points to how this administration in general thinks about resilience, which is really as an integrated issue. And my office, the Office of Planning and Research, within the governor's office, we're tasked with long-range planning for the governor and the cabinet, and we house the Integrated Adaptation and Resilience Program within our office. So it's a governor's office level program that works across all agencies that have any overlap with climate resilience, which is housing, transportation, health, resources, Cal EPA, food and ag are the major ones. And all of us at a secretary level work together on these infrastructure and resilience issues. And we have a technical advisory committee made up of state and local government folks and citizens and advocates who also work with us. So I think the key in California is that we've taken a very integrated approach to these issues. And that's something that we are continuing to do, obviously, going into this very unknown moment that we're walking into right now. And I'll save talking about that till your next question on it, Dan.
Excellent, Kate. Thank you very much. So here we are on Zoom, and we're not in the same room, and so I got to ask, how has the COVID crisis affected your work day to day, and your thinking about resilient infrastructure? Governor Edwards talked some about broadband, which has come up a lot. There are other new types of resilient infrastructure that are out there. So let me go to Katie in Massachusetts to start the round here.
Might be on mute.
There we go.
Here I am.
You're still in the meadow.
I'm still in the meadow, yes. It's nice to see everyone with their backgrounds. I think a couple of themes to pick up on there. Our secretariat does everything from utilities to agriculture to fish and wildlife. And so we've seen sort of a diversity of challenges on our infrastructure across those different sectors. Certainly local food and farms have become a much bigger focus of our attention. How do we make sure that those critical pieces of our food system are able to get their products to market in a way that many of them have not done in the past? And so as schools shut down, as campuses shut down, as restaurants shut down, we've had farmers who had to dump milk. We actually have beer that we're trying to get to anaerobic digesters because the kegs are full and need to be emptied. And so there's a big push with the growing food insecurity issues we've seen to be able to connect local producers directly with food banks and with consumer demand. So that's one piece of infrastructure that we maybe don't think of all the time. I think I would definitely hit on the rural broadband. Governor Baker has had a big last mile program since he came into office in 2014. And that has made $41 million of investments, and every community who does not have rural broadband has either done the project, completed the network, or has a plan to do so. But I heard a great story from a local ski operator who owns 2 mountains in the region. He started a big goggles for docs program to get goggles to frontline hospitals and providers, and he wouldn't have been able to do it out in his rural community a year ago, but because he had rural broadband come through, he connected this huge national effort to get goggles to folks. 2 other pieces I'd mention: obviously utilities have been a key service through all of this. We did have a couple of storms during the height of the pandemic, and a lot of the work what we've done there around resiliency has helped and has made recovery from storms easier. Some of the challenges we've had in the past couple of years with nor'easters, as well as with gas issues, have actually prepared us to be in a better place for this. And so, I think that's a really key part, is looking at this as an opportunity to not just respond to this challenge, but really to bounce up to another level and to prepare. I think every time there's a disaster, the folks on this phone certainly know this, it's not just recovering from that disaster and being better prepared for that disaster, but it's really considering all of the different challenges we might face in the future. And just a last piece I'd mention, because it's given me a lot of hope, at our parks and forests and state wildlife management areas across the state, we've seen something like on the weekends, 150% increase in usership. And so that's put a burden on those open spaces, but it's also highlighted how critical these resources are to all of us. And so many of the things we've needed, many of the deferred maintenance we've needed at some of these natural spaces, I think this is an opportunity, to Colin's point, to get trails built, to do ecological restoration, to continue our programs to remove dams and clear streams. But this has just highlighted the importance of those resources and the investments that are needed that could help.
Right. So, Colin, I'm going to go to you next, and I know the National Wildlife Federation has Ranger Rick, so you're probably providing a whole bunch of distance learning opportunities for parents at this point. We had a question that came in around summer youth programs and youth apprenticeships and some of the idea about getting out and doing that work that you'd mentioned. So want you to address, some aspect of COVID change, but tackle that if you want as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for us. I mean, we're in 15,000 schools across the country, serve 4 or 5 million kids, and so all of a sudden, all of our products that were geared towards teachers, all of a sudden had to be all rewritten and kind of geared towards parents that are trying to be the best at-home educators they can. And so we knocked down paywalls and all of that, but it was actually the distance learning piece, and we found ourselves actually investing in households that actually actually had access to broadband, but just didn't have it in the house, weren't paying for it. So we've actually done some of that work, trying to help folks. And obviously a big push on the Hill to do more of that. But, I think it does show the kind of the gaps in the bigger education system. On the resource side, Katie said it perfectly. I think there's a newfound appreciation around the country for the role of nature, both for exercise, for solace, just for mental sanity. And so, we're trying to make sure folks are recreating responsibly. You have some folks that, try and get out hunting, we're in turkey season, we're in trout season, folks trying to get out. And so, enjoying that, but doing it safely, socially distanced. And, also, we're seeing urban parks that are overrun right now. And so, how do we, continue to have more space? We're also seeing that there's a lot of places that don't have access to outdoor recreation, places, these kind of recreation deserts that exist across the country. So, things that may not be seen as kind of COVID response. There's definitely, Jacoby Wilson talks a lot about how, a lot of the invisible problems have been made visible. I think we're seeing a lot of these inequities. And then look, unfortunately, we're going to see some massive climate impacts in the next few months. The flooding we saw in North Dakota, the dam breaching in Michigan last night. And unfortunately, these natural systems are going to be important in places that have, healthy wetlands and dunes, and forests are going to fare better. And up in Massachusetts, right, the Great Marsh is a more resilient system than other places further south, and the tri-state area that's all the way built out. And so, I think, trying to make the case that saying, look, it's good for health, it's good for kind of mental health, but it's also important for community defense and kind of protection, that, natural resource restoration and kind of natural defenses, if you will, should be, again, a hugely bipartisan issue. And 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when we talked about kind of blending gray infrastructure and green infrastructure is kind of a novelty, and then after Sandy, we all did a bunch of projects together, and then all of a sudden that kind of got proven out. It's completely bipartisan at this point. I mean, you got folks on both sides wanting living shorelines and wanting having healthier forests and having healthier wetlands. And again, it's a bipartisan area. It creates a ton of jobs too. I mean, about 15 to 33 jobs per $1 million in that type of work because it's so labor intensive. So, I mean, that's the kind of infrastructure that we're going to be pushing because we just see huge opportunities for it to move even in divided government.
Thanks, Colin. So, Melissa Roberts, we were talking a couple weeks ago, prepping for the panel, and you were talking about some work you're doing with floods coming in mind and other challenges that will happen on top of COVID. Also, I think you were talking about putting together a playbook, and obviously here comes the tragedy in Michigan that happened yesterday. Can you reflect on some of the work and some of the resources that you guys are developing at AFC?
Yeah, absolutely. And, what's happening in Michigan right now is a truly awful situation, and my heart goes out to the residents there. I mean, we're seeing thousands of people having to evacuate their homes, and in downtown Midland, we're looking at people potentially facing 9 feet of water, which is, unbelievable. But I think the larger takeaway here is that this event's a really important warning about inadequate infrastructure broadly. And to the point that Colin just made, I think we're really seeing some of these invisible impacts made visible again, right? We're seeing the weaknesses in the system get revealed. And unfortunately, with the overlay of COVID, it's at the worst possible time. So, I'd mentioned, we saw the 2 dams that were breached, but it's important to understand this in the context of the fact that 2/3 of the 2,600 dams in Michigan are older than their 50-year design life, right? And it's not just Michigan. This is across the country. And it's not just that our flood infrastructure is being pushed past its design life, it's that the challenges today far exceed the sort of strain that this infrastructure was designed for decades ago, right? We have rising sea levels, stronger storms, much more intense precipitation events. And so it's just fundamentally inadequate. And unfortunately, you see these critical failure points that result in this sort of devastation. But the takeaway isn't just this is a tragedy, which it is. It's that we have to do better because we could have seen this coming, right? We had warnings about this sort of infrastructure failure that's unfortunately being revealed at this worst possible moment when it's a dual disaster scenario. To your point, this is something that we've actually been thinking about for the last month or so, because while, a dam failure is particularly catastrophic because it's really in a compressed time frame. When you think about a dam failure, what usually happens with, say, a hurricane over a couple days, you're seeing happen in a couple hours. So it's just, so difficult to prepare for. Unfortunately, there's going to be local leaders across the country facing the same overlap of COVID and flooding, whether it's spring flooding in the Midwest, intense precipitation like we just saw, or the upcoming hurricane season, which is starting. So, we've been so concerned about this that actually tomorrow, the American Flood Coalition, in partnership with APHA, is releasing a dual disaster handbook on how local leaders can navigate this, because it's just so difficult to say, how do you deal with the challenges of, evacuating people, providing emergency support in the environment of COVID, where you have to start thinking about, you can't fall back on your typical playbook of evacuating people into a big gym together and sheltering them there. That has health risks. So we've tried to really focus in on some specific guidance that can be helpful because this is novel. But I think while we work to kind of navigate the next few months, which I think will be particularly difficult, I think the important takeaway is that we need to invest in the infrastructure that keeps pace with the reality of flooding so that we don't find ourselves in these sorts of dual disaster scenarios, or for that matter, single disaster, scenarios again, because while this particular overlay or some of these particularly catastrophic failures are hard to predict, the idea that our infrastructure is, wholly inadequate, isn't keeping pace is something that I think everyone here, and I know, you and the folks at United for Infrastructure have been talking about for a really long time and is incredibly well known, unfortunately.
Thanks, Melissa. So, Kate Gordon, before COVID hit, you were out with a really big set of great ideas around a $5 billion resilience bond in California, emergency facilities, microgrids, and other things that are doubly relevant in our now dual disaster world that we are in. Is California faring? And if you'd like to also focus as we sort of turn to the last round in terms of what the federal government can do from your perspective, weigh in, please.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we, like every state, I mean, we're not unique in this, but we really have suffered some significant budget shocks in the last few months. We went from a $6 billion surplus with our January budget that we put out a January budget and then revise it for May every year, the governor's budget, and then we negotiate with the legislature. And our January budget had an assumption of a $6 billion surplus, which our legislature said was actually conservative, and included $12.5 billion in a climate budget that included a resilience bond for exactly the kind of natural infrastructure investment we've been talking about here to reduce climate risk, for a $1 billion catalyst fund to catalyze private sector investment in climate projects, particularly for small business, and also a range of programs under our greenhouse gas reduction fund or our cap and trade program. We, in our May revision, which came out last week, project a $54 billion deficit. So we've gone from extreme to extreme. I know everybody else has as well. And like everyone, we're dealing with a combination of a massive amount of spending. We have over 4 million unemployed Californians, $12 billion spent already on unemployment in the state. And our revenue is disproportionately from income tax. And so it's just been a very, very hard reality. And so we have taken off the table for now, both the Catalyst Fund, although we're continuing to look very hard at both federal support through some of the infrastructure bank discussions that are happening federally for the Catalyst Fund, and at private sector involvement. We found over 700 projects for that pipeline that are projects that are ready to go with low or no interest loans or loan guarantees. And we feel like it's an opportunity we have to grab. So we're still working on that. The bond is something that's actively being discussed by the legislature, who may try to put something on the ballot. We are not sponsoring a bond at this point from the governor's office, but we're watching those conversations very closely. And it is interesting to note that the polling for the November ballot, the idea of a resilience bond with that framing actually is still very popular as a potential ballot measure. So I think people are in a mode actually where they're thinking about, to Melissa's point, reducing future risk. I think that's where people's heads are right now. And this is a moment to be talking about that. I did want to say, just in terms of our sort of, how are we pivoting to thinking about, from incident to recovery, as our Office of Emergency Services always says. We're obviously thinking a lot about recovery, as everybody is. And I really want to underscore Melissa's point about our infrastructure, the cracks showing in our infrastructure. But I want to say, I think that's true in our social infrastructure as well. The cracks have really shown in terms of how we run our economies. We, have a disproportionate number of folks who are unemployed now who make under $15 an hour in California. We have a disproportionate impact on folks who are undocumented. We are seeing the failures of a system that isn't resilient for people and for human infrastructure. At the same time, we're seeing the failures of a system that's not resilient for physical infrastructure. And we're really focused through the governor's Jobs and Economic Recovery Task Force he's put together on this question of building a more resilient economy overall. How do we think about incorporating these ideas of not just job numbers, but job quality, of pathways into good jobs for folks who are, undocumented or formerly incarcerated or underserved youth or women and veterans? How do we think about building that into the system, building back a better system, not only through the physical infrastructure itself, but by tying investments in physical infrastructure, ideally from the federal government in particular through stimulus, but also wherever we're investing our state dollars, tying those dollars to really strong, what we, Dan, from our previous world would call high road, strategies around, again, job quality, pathways into good jobs, and around sustainability. So I just think that that's been key for us. And this moment has really underscored why we have to think about those things together. Because ultimately, if we build back an economy that's the same as what we just are coming through here, we are vulnerable. We are as vulnerable to future disruptions, whether they're from climate change or from pandemics, as we were to this one. And we will see what we see now, which is just massive unemployment, homelessness, and pain across our communities. And so we don't think we can do that as the 5th largest economy in the world. We feel like we've got to model a better way forward. So that's what we're focused on.
Thanks, Kate. And, I think as we're going to go another 5 minutes to get a few final insights from folks around this question of what's the best thing the federal government can do that's additive to the great work and the spending that happens at the state and local level. And we've had a couple of questions about the role of funding and finance and public-private partnerships. I do want to point out that later episodes of this series are going to get into actual detailed vignettes of how folks can build rural wastewater facilities and fund and finance broadband and other issues like that. So that promise will come. I'm ignoring all the questions about what does resilience mean. It is a Rorschach ink blot, but I think everyone's going to answer it on a local and regional level. Katie, Colin, and Melissa, let's say a minute each on your best advice for what, not the total amount of dollars, but what are the types of dollars you'd like to see come out of DC to help you and your work? Let's start with Katie.
Well, I think number one priority is for flexibility in spending given to the states. I think different states are going to know what they need best working with their locals. And flexibility in planning the deployment of that spending. I think one of the things that we have sort of teed up, we did a combined state hazard mitigation climate adaptation plan, and in that plan we identified a huge number of investments across state government and local government that are ready for the round of funding of something of this, not just in physical infrastructure, but in some of the things Kate noted. And so I think there is increased realization around the role of essential workers going forward and supporting people as part of infrastructure as well, whether it's childcare, parks, food and local food, or first responders. But on the physical infrastructure side, there's a big role for that in federal stimulus dollars. It does need to be flexible, and we need to build in all of the go forward on climate resilient infrastructure. We can't just be building back. And then finally, the last piece I'd note is, the last round of federal stimulus in the 2010 timeframe, we were able to make significant progress on clean energy and climate priorities. And so I would call out for that. Again, this is the time to do it. I know that's less bipartisan, but I think being able to transition to a clean energy economy as part of this is a key piece of the resilient go forward.
Great. Colin, 1 minute.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with a lot of what the Secretary said. I think that for me, on the natural resource side, we think there's about $125 billion worth of projects that could move in the next 3 years. Looking at kind of across the federal estate, I mean, that's real money. I mean, that would create several million jobs. But I also think doing fewer bigger things as opposed to like the little, I think one of the problems with ERA, I was the state secretary in Delaware at the time, and and one of the challenges was that there were so many like niche programs, right? So you got, $200,000 for this thing, and you got $800,000 for that thing, and you got, and so I would rather see, kind of a big focus on like the coastal resilience grants have worked incredibly well. I think they did like $280 million last time. There was like $3 billion worth of demand, like meet that kind of demand, but pitch things based on kind of the actual project need as opposed to just kind of the wish list that'll happen through approps and through the committee process. But, we're going to need $10 to $20 billion for forestry type projects. And, that's both safety for communities as well as, reforestation and forest management. I mean, these are big chunks, but I'd rather focus on like the big wedges as opposed to like the niche programs where everyone's fighting for their own, nonsense and doesn't actually really add up to anything that matches the magnitude of the moment. So.
Excellent. Melissa, a minute on federal advice?
Yeah, well, building on this theme of flexibility, the number one thing for me is giving state and local governments the flexibility to spend some of this money on the planning and pre-development costs that often get left out, right? Funding is good, but if you want to make sure that the right projects get into development, you need to actually let people spend money figuring out what are the right projects, how you plan them, and how you come up with really innovative, resilient, smart concepts that can, you know, save money in the long run. And you don't get that by just insisting that you have to have shovel-ready projects now. And if you don't submit whatever's already on the shelf, you're going to lose out. So I think we've got to accept that planning and pre-development are real costs. And if you do that well, you get a lot of benefits. You create jobs, prevent costly rebuilds down the line, and you can get all of these other benefits. We're talking about coastal restoration and quality of life improvements. So we can have it all if we're smart about the flexibility for where you can spend the money.
Well, you know, from that Jerry Maguire movie, you had me at pre-development. So the focus on life cycle thinking and life cycle asset management and reducing deferred maintenance costs is certainly a theme that we think will be coming up in our series over and over again. This is our first of 6, so come back next Wednesday and we'll take it up again. I want to give you a little preview. Next week, we've got Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley and his Cross the River regional partner, Boone County, Kentucky Executive Judge Gary Moore. We'll have an expert panel with the Siemens CEO, Barbara Humpton, Houston Public Works Director, Carroll Haddock, the Port of New Orleans President and CEO, Brandy Christian. I want to quickly thank our speakers for today, the 4 that were on the great panel just now, as well as Governor Edwards and Suzanne Clark at the Chamber. And really want to thank our series presenting sponsor, Hannon Armstrong, and the wonderful teams at the Milken Institute and United for Infrastructure. Finally, I do want to say to the students in my Georgetown infrastructure class watching at home today, there will be a quiz on this. Everyone else is on their honor. That's a wrap. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, guys.